a special two-part firing line on the occasion of the publication of Ronald Reagan's autobiography, An American Life. This program is a production of SECA. Funding for Firing Line is made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Mobile Corporation, L. John Polite, Jr., the Friends of Firing Line, and by the financial support of viewers like you.
The memoirs of Ronald Reagan have been published. The book is called An American Life, and the title is strangely credible. Initially, one resists the idea that a young man from Dixon, Illinois, brought up in modest circumstances, who became a sportscaster and after that a movie actor, a lecturer on the General Electric circuit, the governor of California, president of the United States, who after his first term was sent back to the White House for a second term, carrying more states than Roosevelt did against London, is in any workaday sense merely an American life. But at no point in this 700-page book does the reader find himself dealing other than with a man whose values are distinctively American. Ronald Reagan's experiences are rooted in the American way, and his career could not have been shaped other than in America. As we read about his experiences in Hollywood, on the speaking circuit, in the Goldwater campaign, responding to the sudden draft by close friends to enter politics, learning while taking a shower that he had been elected 40th President of the United States, confronting in Washington crises brought on by the Soviet Union, the stock market, Congress, Israel, Nicaragua, Lebanon, terrorists. The book absorbs the reader in the developing portrait of an American life. The book is full of intimate glimpses, riding through Windsor Park with the Queen of England, saying hello to the Pope in Alaska, urging Gorbachev to just call him Ron. Yet it is the closest we are likely to get to the history of the 1980s in America, and the closest we will ever get to a portrait of someone who feels it unnatural to draw open the curtain on his private life, and yet succeeds in illuminating that life by giving his reactions to public situations that give him pain and pleasure. Since the first few years of his presidency, Mr. Reagan was criticized primarily because of his association with what they call Reaganomics. I thought to explore what he says in his book on that subject. Accordingly, my first question, how do you define Reaganomics?
Well, I did have some very firm beliefs. First of all, I spent 4 years getting a degree in economics in college. And later, I maybe should confess that the college brought me back 25 years later and gave me an honorary degree. And that compounded a sense of guilt because I always figured the first one was honorary. But, no, I had a very strong belief that, and based some on actual history of this country, that tax cuts, for example, very often, if not always, resulted in more money for the government rather than less. And thinking of this goes clear back in my studies to a man named Ibn Khaldun in Egypt. And Ibn Khaldun said at the beginning of the empire, the rates were low, but the revenue was great. At the end of the empire, the rates were great, but the revenue was low. And so this economic program that we put into effect, incidentally, I knew it was succeeding when they stopped calling it Reaganomics. But a lot of this was based on, and I believe that, well, I'm leaving out a line. The fact is that for 8 years we had the longest and biggest economic recovery and economic growth in our entire history.
Well, why did you run into opposition to it, given the fact that Jack Kennedy, for instance, had specifically endorsed a sharp reduction in taxes, which were, in fact, undertaken after he was assassinated under Lyndon Johnson? How do you account for the opposition that you did have? Was it simply people who hadn't made it in economics?
I think so. But also, frankly, the opposing party has always been the party of wanting more revenues. And
but you just finished pointing out that they, in fact, get more revenues with lower taxes.
They somehow, they refuse to believe it. But if you look back at when Coolidge handled the World War I debt, the same thing took place. He was one who believed that if you lessen the share of the person's earnings that the government takes, the person is not going to be as ambitious as he might be. I remembered from my own days in pictures. In pictures, it was very easy to get into the top bracket. And once you got there, and the top bracket...
You didn't earn any money.
The top bracket, I remember, was 84% at one time. Well, you could have offered me the greatest picture in the world, and I wouldn't have done it once I got there. Who's going to work for 6 cents on the dollar? And,
well, you don't explain in your book why in 1981, when the first act went through, you consented to cutting that 10% down to 5% the first year, which some people think was a responsible cause for the depth of the recession in 1982.
Well, we had a great problem with, frankly, a hostile Congress. All the time I was president, the House of Representatives was majority Democratic. And they were opposed to very much of what I wanted to do. So sometimes you had to compromise. And instead of having it come instantly, why, we stretched it out so over a few years. Some of these taxes or tax cuts took effect. As a matter of fact, in the first few years of the income tax cuts, the revenue increased $375 billion. But the Congress increased spending $450. And I felt very strongly that, and still do, that a principal part of our economic recovery program was based around the tax policies. See, when I got into office, I found, well, there was double-digit inflation. There was a 20.5% prime rate, interest prime rate. There was double-digit unemployment, and the whole thing was, and then, of course, there was the matter of our national safety. For example, I found out when I took office that on any given day, fully half of our military aircraft couldn't fly for lack of spare parts. Half of our naval vessels couldn't leave port for that or for lack of crew. Well, I felt, and had a very strong inner feeling,
that had to have some priority.
That peace could only be obtained through strength. I never adhered to the MAD, the MAD policy, mutual assured destruction. That's like those old days of the two Westerners, each one with a gun aimed at the other's head.
Yeah, right.
And I thought, the first meeting that I ever held with Gorbachev, I made it plain that we could not have an arms race, or we could have an arms race. Yeah. It was up to him, because there was no way we were going to allow them to maintain a superiority over us.
But let's hold off on foreign policy for just a minute. I want to zip up this whole tax business.
Right.
You kept a journal. Oh, I learned from reading your book. Even no matter how brief it was, your comments, it allowed you to re-invoke the spirit of that particular day.
Yes.
And now, in one of those entries, 1982, you decide to encourage a fresh act. But this is one which calls for fresh taxation. But in it you say this is going to be worthwhile because for every dollar that we raise in taxes, Congress will reduce expenses by $2. Now, in fact, they didn't do that, did they?
That's it. The only way I gave in on that whole program was they came and guaranteed me a $2 reduction in spending for every dollar of revenue we obtained in the tax change, and they just violated it. They never enforced that. They never did it.
Now, explain to us, I think it would be interesting for our viewers, when you say they came to us and made that promise, are you talking about an Oval Office situation, or are you talking about a telephone call? By what techniques do the leaders of Congress communicate a commitment of that nature to a president?
They were meeting with my people, and, you know, and the people having to do with all of these things. And my people brought this proposal to me and told me that they had been guaranteed that there would be $2 reduction in spending for every additional dollar of revenue. Well, I couldn't turn that down.
No.
And so no matter how I felt about the tax changes, I said okay. But it just never happened.
Has President Bush had a chance to read that chapter?
I think he knows about that. He was actually a part of all our administration and played a major role in all the years that he was vice president.
Yeah, but it's interesting that there was a repeated sequence here. They've been talking about this much more taxes and this much cutting down. But I was wondering whether there was a way by which a president could bind Congress to their share of a contract of that kind, but there isn't, is there?
Well, no, not when they have come to you with a cash proposal. Mm-hmm. And of the kind of where a budgeting thing, I mean, that they X number of dollars for this program, X number for that one. Well, this was a little different. This was a promise just of a reduction of revenues.
So, retrospectively, you're sorry that the 1982 Act had your endorsement.
Yes.
But then we go on to 1986. Now, the 1986 Act, in which the top bracket was reduced to 33%, and at some point 28%, had tremendous endorsement by the Democrats. Was that because of the success of the 1981 Act?
I'm quite sure it has to be, yes. They could not turn their back on the fact that we had had the longest economic growth period in our nation's history. And it came with that economic program that we launched.
Now I would ask you a question that you don't address directly in your book. You tend to rely on empirical arguments for reducing the rate of taxation. You don't enter much of the philosophical argument of the kind that Hayek and Friedman and so on do, which is an argument that resists the principle of polarized taxation, of paying different rates. Are you sympathetic with that criticism, or do you feel that rates ought to be steeply progressive?
Well, no, the fact is that we reduced from 14 tax brackets, to 3. Mm-hmm. And somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 million people at the bottom of the ladder were totally removed from paying income tax. And when I hear these arguments coming at me now, that I do everything in support of the rich and so forth.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, well, they're talking about the 1% of that top bracket of 1% of wage earners in this country. That 1% is now paying, even though we're down to the 28% tax rate, they are paying more than 20% of the total revenue from income tax is being paid by that 1% of earners. Now, how can that, when you've taken at the other end of the ladder some people away from paying anything, how can you say that the rich are not paying their share?
Well, the way they say it is this. They say that after your presidency, although they were paying more taxes, they were absorbing net a larger part of the gross national product.
Well, you can't have The gross national product has a thing for the return to the people and so forth on that, without it reflecting those who are paying the taxes.
Yeah, besides which, that particular analysis tends to ignore that the fact that the income of the lowest quintile does not take into account the cash value of what they receive for nothing, food stamps,
Yes.
Medicare, and et cetera, et cetera.
That's right.
But in point of fact, it seems to me the statistics bear out your own conclusions, which is that every quintile in America profited, and the gross national product went up hugely. But that leaves us facing the deficit.
Yes.
In the book, you bemoan your own inability to do something substantial about it, and when you consider running, whether you will run for the second term, you say, well, at least if I do, it'll give me, among other things, a chance to tame the deficit. So even after 4 years, you thought you could do something about it, but you failed.
Well, at the same time, though, every budget that I submitted to Congress, which I have to do under the Constitution as president, every one of them represented a reduction, not in the budget of the previous year, but a reduction in the increase that Congress was asking for. We did not give them all their total increase in that. But my budgets, every one of them, the Congress put on the shelf and called them dead on arrival, and then would return to me, in place of a budget, continuing resolution.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it'd be this high. That thick, thousands of pages of paper.
You sprained your finger once trying to lift it.
That's right. And I wasn't fooling. It really hurt. But this continuing resolution, because the President of the United States does not have what 43 governors have, and what I'd have as governor, the line item veto, you are faced with either signing that entire document or vetoing it. If you veto it, the government is out of business. Everything stops. You can't even send out paychecks and so forth. So you can't go through those thousands of pages and not find spendthrift things that shouldn't have been done and that the people didn't need, but that were pets of some members of the Congress. But you were faced with that choice. You had to sign or else.
There is a school of constitutional thought that says that the line item veto inheres in presidential prerogatives as specified in the Constitution. Were you ever tempted to try that out by vetoing a part of a bill and to see whether the Supreme Court would sustain you?
Well, I had suggested such a thing, but nobody ever thought that it was worthwhile doing. I had to veto the whole thing or else. And it is fair. Well, let me just point out a contrast. As governor of California for 8 years, having that, I used the line item veto 943 times.
And was never overruled.
Was never overruled once. Even though the legislature that had sent me the things that I line item vetoed took a 2/3 majority of them to send it to me. It only took 2/3 to override my veto.
Yeah.
But they never could get the 2/3 when they had to vote for this item standing out there all by itself where the people could see it. When they could bury it in a package, well, then they'd try.
Well, why is that not a more? Why was that not a more important part of your agenda in the second term?
The line item
to
veto.
give you line item veto.
You couldn't even get it off the ground. There was a congressman there that was on our side and kept trying to promote such an idea, and I asked for it and begged for it, and no way. The Congress, the one party, has been in control of the House of Representatives for 59 of the last 55 years, for 55 of the last 59 years. And during all that time, you will find history relates that they constantly are nibbling away at the authority of the presidency. And their programs to, as I say, well, for example, I came across one program once and had an awful time trying to do something about it. It was a program to help certain elements of the needy. The administrative overhead was $2 for every dollar that reached a needy person. Now, there's something wrong with that kind of a program. Many of the times I've been attacked as wanting to do away with charitable programs and so forth. Now, most of the time, what I was trying to do away with was the tremendous overhead. When I got that commission of businessmen to look into government and find out
The Grace Commission?
the Grace Mission,
Yeah.
to find out, either Grace, where could modern business practices be put to work to help reduce the cost of government. We implemented almost 800 of those, but there were 2,478 in total. If I were still there right now, I would be looking at those because to see if we could not start public wave campaigns for them.
I figured it was a lost cause when the very first one that Peter Grace recommended was reducing the pensions of public servants. That didn't make him very popular.
Well, no, and there were some things like that, and I'm sure that we'd find some that we didn't think of. But let's take another example. People in supervisory positions in our government, their salary is based on the number of people they supervise. Now, are you ever going to have a supervisor who decides that he can do the program with less employees?
Yeah.
If it means cutting his salary?
Well, now, on this business of nibbling away at the power of the president, our impression has been that under Franklin Roosevelt, the enhancement of presidential powers became some sort of a menace, and his attempt to pack the Supreme Court was, of course, the most flamboyant example of that. But when you say you want line item veto, it isn't really that you want more power. It's that you want power that really relates to the organic exercise of your authority, right? Because it must have been an oversight by the founders that they didn't specify that you could veto any single part of the bill, right?
There's another thing that also that we should have, and that is a constitutional amendment preventing the president, preventing the government from running a deficit. Now, the first man who ever proposed that was the founder of the Democratic Party, Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
When he first read the Constitution, he said it has one glaring omission. It does not have a clause preventing the federal government from going into debt.
Right, right. Well, you backed it, and it was passed in the House, in the Senate, but never reached the House. Is that correct?
Well, that was the one thing in the first term and not in the second. But in the first term, I had a bare majority in the Senate. And that was the first time in a long time also for a Republican president. But that made the difference, because now it was not just the president against the whole Congress. It was the president and the Senate against the House of Representatives. And you could gain more, and they had to give more in those situations.
But you got your two-thirds vote, didn't you, in the Senate, which you have to have for a constitutional amendment.
Well, for a constitutional amendment, I couldn't get that without, yes.
But you got two-thirds of the Senate, even though you had only a bare majority of Republicans. That's my memory, isn't it? I'm pretty sure you did, because otherwise, a constitutional amendment...
I can't remember what the count was on the vote. No, it was outvoted.
Yeah, with it was Tip O'Neill who kept it from coming to the floor in the House, wasn't it?
Yes.
Now, you have an interesting portrait of Tip O'Neill. One has the impression that he's invincibly ignorant and rather endearing.
Well, I made a point when I first got in office. One of the first things was to call on him. And I didn't send for him to come to me. I went to him. And we exchanged some views and so forth, and what we would do. And Out of that, I remember one thing he did say in that meeting. He said, well, at last you're in the big leagues. And I said, well, I think I've been in the big leagues for several years. Since California, if it were a nation, it would be the 7th ranking economic power in the world. But anyway, we got along, and Nancy and I had Tip and his wife over for dinner. And then one day I picked up the paper and read where he had made a statement about me that was pretty harsh. And I called him, and I said, Tip, I thought we had a relationship here where we could do business together and all, and now I read in the paper that you said... And he interrupted me and said, well, old buddy, that's just politics. He said, after 6 o'clock, we're buddies, we're friends.
Was Jesse Unruh the same way?
Huh?
Was Jesse Unruh the same way?
No. No, but I'm with Tip, I did take it that every once in a while when we had a meeting, I would visibly set my watch at above 6 o'clock.
But, would you, if you were a founding father, redraft the Constitution so as to make Congress and the President members of the same party?
No, I wouldn't do that. But what is needed now is a change in the every 10 years redistricting. For one house to hold that majority, 55 out of 59 years, this is a result of gerrymandering. And it still goes on because the Congress has a hand in it and the state legislature. Now, of course, they are going to, when they have to change districts every 10 years to meet population changes and so forth, when I got out of the president's office, got back home, I sent for a map of the congressional districts in the Los Angeles area.
Mr. President, we have to stop for just a minute.
No.
Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Mobile Corporation. L.